First, a little housekeeping. We are in listen only mode, so make sure your mic is muted. If you're having Wi Fi issues, you may want to turn off your camera and any other programs you have running. Please make note of the chat feature on your screen. Please use the chat feature for communication as we will not be taking questions by audio. Isabel Rogers of Dewberry is monitoring the chat and will try to help you with any technical matters. Please be sure to post to everyone when using the chat. We are offering 1 hour of continuing education credit for CFMs. To receive the credit, you must be logged in separately, answer all poll questions during this session, and provide your name and email at the end of the presentation. Poll questions should appear as a pop-up on the screen, but may appear in the chat box. If you have issues answering the poll questions, please be sure to check the chat box and use the radio buttons to respond. A copy of the presentation will be emailed to all attendees. Also, a survey link will be provided at the end of the presentation. We appreciate you completing the survey so that we may improve these webinars in the future. We are recording today's webinar and plan to post the video to georgiadfarm.com. With that, let's get started. Today we have a presentation about flooding, a year-round danger in Georgia. Our presenters are Laura Bellinger and Todd Hamill of the National Weather Service. Laura is the Senior Service Hydrologist for the National Weather Service Forecast Office in Peachtree City, Georgia, where she's been part of the team for almost 20 years. After she was heavily influenced by Atlanta's epic floods of 2009, Laura pursued operational hydrology and hydrology services, which has led her to her current position. Todd is the Service Coordinator Hydrologist in the Southeast River Forecast Center. He serves as the focal point for all outreach and coordination activities for the Southeast River Forecast Center. And with that, I'll now turn it over to Laura and Todd.
Okay, I'm assuming you can hear me okay?
Hear you just fine.
Okay, so yes, we'll get started. And I've been with River Forecast Center since the mid-90s. 94, I got to Atlanta and have been there since then. And this is the office, our office, which is located in Peachtree City, Georgia. We are co-located, so we are in the same office. One of the larger offices in the Weather Service. And for this reason, we are the Southeast River Forecast Center, and we cover an area that ranges from Virginia, up the southern part of Virginia, all through much of the Southeast, over into just a little bit of Mississippi in the water that drains into Mobile Bay, and then down to Florida. We also provide river forecast services for Puerto Rico, and help them in their river flooding. There are 11 river forecast centers across the country, and we just happen to be one of them, and we're co-located with the office here in Peachtree City, which Laura will talk about a little bit.
Which brings us to this slide. So as Todd mentioned, we are the Weather Forecast Office located in Peachtree City. We happen to be the only office in the state, or that has responsibilities in the state, that's physically located in Georgia. You can see our neighbors along the Carolina border and then down into Florida. So there's actually 6 offices total that share these duties. We're one of 122 offices in the United States. And a little fun fact about us, we actually have the most number of counties of any other weather forecast office in the country, 96.
Yes, so, and we support all of these offices. We do a lot of things by river basin, and they're by location of where they are, certainly because of the radars that are in the Southeast. That's where kind of how they've lined up where they're located and why they're where they are. So what I'm going to do, that's kind of a small overview of us. And so I'm going to do a climatological assessment of flood events in Georgia. And we do this for the flood fight course that Laura puts on each October. And this is kind of an abbreviated version of that. And so we'll first talk about the spectrum of flooding in Georgia. And you can see, because of the diverse area in Georgia, we have a bunch of different ways we can see flooding. Urban flash flooding, a lot of times around the cities, Atlanta, Macon, Augusta, where we will see urban flash flooding. Up in the north part of Georgia, we'll see with steeper terrain that promotes flash flooding, just because it rains hard up there and it runs off very quickly. As you start to get into the coastal, or get into the plains of Georgia just south of the fall line, we have typical river flooding. So a lot of times, even though we might get river flooding in the north part of the state, it has to go somewhere. So it heads south through the rest of the state. And then as we talked about, slower coastal plain river flooding and ponding of water down in the southern part of the state. So that water has to go somewhere. So that water takes a little bit longer to get through and is a longer flood threat. We can get hurricanes, and we can get them out of the Gulf of Mexico, or we can get them out of the Atlantic, and it tends to affect different parts of the state. So as we start to talk about the climatology of flooding in Georgia, kind of so that you understand, a small scale flood are events that are geographically isolated. So they might affect 1 or 2 counties and will be usually less than 3 hours. So, we call them flash flooding, but they happen very quickly. They end pretty quickly. And so we'll talk about that type of flooding first. Then we'll go to large scale flooding. And those are events that include multiple counties. And they tend to go they go certainly over 3 hours, but the 6 to 12 hour range. But those can often include flooding up to a few weeks as it moves through our river systems from the north to the south and over to the east to get to the Atlantic. And then we'll talk about tropical. And so as we start to talk about tropical, we kind of pull out all the small and large scale events that were affected by tropical systems. So these are kind of separated out because they can be a little bit of both. So we pulled those specifically out so you can kind of see what that was. And so as we start to talk about that here in just a moment, know that that's how they're described, and that's what the statistics we're talking about. So for Georgia small scale flooding, you can definitely see a pattern here. This is a monthly distribution of small scale flood events. And if you'll notice at the bottom, June, July, August are probably the ones where we get the most small scale flooding. So you can imagine what that might be. Afternoons around 2 o'clock or so, we start to get pop-up type thunderstorms. And so that May through September is when we tend to get those small scale floods. Although, as you'll see through this whole presentation, for the most part, floods can happen in any month of the year. And so we always have to be very careful of that. They just seem to be more prevalent, these small scale floods, during the summer for that reason. And then we'll talk a little bit about the timing of it. A lot of times in the afternoon, in that 2 to 3 o'clock time frame, you'll start to look out your window and start to see the clouds start to pop up, and we'll start to get heavy rain. And because those storms tend not to move very quickly, they tend to stay over one area, we will get some flash flooding because we'll get heavy rain in that area just for a very short period of time. And that will usually continue into the evening and sometimes maybe into the late evening hours. But the focus of that really is in that afternoon time frame. Again, we can get those type of small scale rainfall events anytime. And as we look at the overnight and the morning, sometimes we'll get large scale systems that have moved out of the Midwest and sometimes affect us in the morning and the overnight and in the morning. But for the most part, it is in that afternoon time frame. And so where does the small scale flooding occur? Well, one of the things you'll notice, a couple different, this is the percentage of all the events and where they are. And you'll see the 18% right around Atlanta. I mentioned before the urban and small stream flooding. Well, this is where we get a lot of that. We have a lot more people in the Atlanta area, a lot more concrete. And so we tend to get a little bit more flash flooding. The other two higher parts, one is up in the mountains, because when we do get heavy rain up in the mountains, we can sometimes get that 11% that's up there at the top. We can get some rain in those areas, but it runs off very quickly and get flash flooding. And then down near the coast, we can get sea breeze thunderstorms right along the coast, and that will sometimes cause some flash flooding. So that's our small scale flash flooding. And so now we'll start to talk about Georgia large scale flooding. And remember, I mentioned that this is more on a larger scale. It's not just a county or two. This is where we get the kind of the full brunt of flooding. And one of the patterns you'll notice at least a little bit here is at the end where we have the December and 12%, January 15%, all the way through March that gets to 18%. we tend to have a lot more flooding during that time. We don't necessarily get more rain during that time, but we have less competition for water. And when I say less competition for water, what I mean by that is that we don't have, during the winter months, we don't have leaves on the trees. It's not very hot out. So when it does rain, it doesn't dry out as quickly. So we can, so when it does rain, the runoff becomes more efficient. A lot more water can get to the streams and produce flooding in the areas. The same rainfall in January or February is not going to affect things the same way as in June and July. A lot of times in June and July, if we get a 3 to 4 inch rainfall, we don't expect much from it simply because the ground has dried out. We've had dry weather before that. But as you start to look at rainfall in January and February, 3 to 4 inches, a lot more of that will run off. And so we'll tend to get more flooding. So that's kind of our recharge season or our flood season, all depending on how you want to look at that. So Georgia large scale flooding, the percentage, you see that the percentages start to spread out a little bit. We still have a lot in Atlanta, and I think only because we have a lot of forecast points around Atlanta. I think that has a lot to do with it. But because the large scale flooding, when we do get flooding in, say, Athens or north of the in the Savannah Basin and so forth, they will tend to run down and run through the state. And so everyone tends to get more large scale flooding because it takes a little bit more time to get through. And so that's why we see a more broad scale on that. So now we'll go to tropical. And so this is our monthly distribution of tropical flood events. And I think this one's pretty obvious. Does anybody know when hurricane season begins? Yeah, it begins in June. I know that we've got a little bit in May there. We've had some early season storms that have affected things in the last few years. And so our hurricane season runs from June through November, actually into December. And so that's the reason we see all of these focused in that area. And so this is very logical and what can be expected. So you'll also notice that our percentage of the total tends to shift a little bit. As we see that there's the 15% and 14% as we get close to the Georgia coast and the Atlantic, that's where our higher percentages are. But we can get a storm out of the Gulf of Mexico, or we can get a storm on the other side, and they'll affect different parts of the state. And because they'll affect different parts of the state, all depending on where they come from, we can have that type of flooding anywhere in those areas. So that's the reason we see that. And so tropical flooding, we do have this through 2016. We have been working on some more climatology to add years to this to show, but it does kind of show a yearly distribution of the tropical flood events. And we've gone through quiet times where we only had one or two or a few events that have affected, or even years where we've had none affect the Southeast during that time. And then we have years like 1994 and 95, where over that period, we saw 32. And then over the 2004 and 2005 period, we saw 35. So we can have very busy periods and we can have quiet periods. The one thing we have to remember, and I think Laura will probably mention this too, because I think it's important, is that all it takes is one in the Southeast. All it takes is one that affects your area, and it's been a busy year for you. So we had some busy years. We've had some quiet years. It kind of goes back and forth. So fatalities. So we'll do a little thing about fatalities, and this was a recent output from the National Hurricane Center in Florida, who supports our work here too. And they did a study that looked at direct fatalities from tropical systems from 2013 to 2022. And while we knew before that freshwater flooding had a significant death toll from it, and that storm surge was very close, what they found in the last 10 years is that freshwater flooding has taken that over, and that most of the deaths during tropical systems has come from freshwater flooding. Again, storm surge, wind, tornado, all of those things, and the surf and marine, they're all still very dangerous and need to be paid attention to. But freshwater flooding, which occurs inland from that, some people just don't think about. So this is a good reminder for those who are further inland and think they're not impacted by hurricanes just because they're not on the coast. It can still be very deadly. And so that's, as the Weather Service, we try to remind people of the threats from that. And so when we look at Georgia flood deaths from 1987 to 2016, you can see that we have had numerous flood deaths in the Southeast. The one in the 21 that you see down in the southwest part of the state, that came from 1994. Most of those deaths in Tropical Storm Alberto. We look at the 8 in Atlanta. Some of those came from the 2009 floods. And so Laura will focus a little bit more on some of these, but you can see that it can happen in any part of the state, and that it does. And so Georgia, so autos, and we look at each of the different ways that people have died during those events, and you can see that the autos is probably the biggest one. Oftentimes it's dark. People drive into areas that they're familiar with and didn't realize could have water flowing over a bridge and have issues with that. But we have had in the house, people swimming in ditches, in rescuing people, and in evacuation. But driving in a car is the most dangerous one as far as that goes. And then you can see that up to 2004 U.S. flood fatalities, activity of victims. Again, it's mostly driving, as you see from there. Georgia flood deaths by age. It doesn't discriminate on age. It has happened from being very young to very old. And again, it's very dangerous, and it's usually in places that people don't think can be a danger. But when you start getting high water and moving water, it can become very, very dangerous. By male and female and gender, maybe this means that males are bigger risk takers. And maybe this is just an anomaly, but we do tend to have more males that die from this than females. And the last I'll show, I think this is my last slide until Laura chats, is the Georgia deaths by year. And I've kind of highlighted a little bit of those, but I think Laura's going to go a little bit more in depth with some of these events and how they were affected. But before we get to her, we have got a question for you. And so I think it will likely show up in the chat, or it will pop up, one of the two. So what time of day does small scale flooding typically occur in Georgia? And so if you can just answer that, remember this is small scale flooding. What time does it occur typically in Georgia?
So I'll just chime in here really quick. If you are here and want to receive an hour of CFM continuing education credit, please answer the question. And if you can't answer using the poll, just put your answer in the chat, and we'll just give a few minutes now to review and answer the poll question. Okay, and looks like our answers are slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. It looks like most people have selected afternoon.
And that is the correct answer. That is the correct answer. You know, as mentioned, I know we have an evening, someone who said evening on there, and it does sometimes trail into the evening, but typically it happens in the afternoon. We tend to see it in that afternoon time frame. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Laura, and she's going to talk a little bit about Georgia's flood history.
Yeah, so some of you may be, not lifetime residents of the state of Georgia. And so we did want to spend some time covering some of Georgia's flood history. So if you look at this from a timeline perspective, if we go back to the 1800s all the way to more modern history, We've had some really significant flooding events that have sort of peppered that timeline over the years, just all the way back from 1886 to some significant Rome flooding, to more recently in December 2015, which we sort of call here the Christmas flood. So let's talk about this a little bit from a seasonal perspective. We'll break these down. If we're looking at our spring events, so Todd just shared with you earlier that sometimes that late winter, early spring timeframe can be really significant for us. Back in 1886 up in Rome, there was some significant flooding on the Ustanala River, and the local lore at the time says that the water really rose to cover Broad Street in downtown Rome, and caused such significant flooding that afterwards, as part of the mitigation kind of process, what they decided to do, instead of building a levee, which they deemed too costly, they actually raised the street. And so the first floor of all the Main Street buildings became the basements, and the storefronts became that second story. And you can actually go take tours of the basement and see the original storefronts for a lot of these Main Street buildings. So there's actually a high water mark you can go see right there that really shows that demarcation of where that water level rose, but a really highly impactful event there. And from a smaller scale perspective, there was one back in 1938 in a little place called Whitestone Valley in Gilmer County. There was actually a railroad bridge that sort of accumulated water behind the embankment, and then when it broke through, it sent a flood wave down through Whitestone Valley. And just about to the right of the caboose car here that you see in the picture, there was a general store, and unfortunately, there were quite a few people that perished there as a result. If we switch over to some summer events more recently, and probably for some of you, your actual lifetime memory was Tropical Storm Alberto in 1994. This still continues to hold the record for the highest 24-hour rainfall total at any point in Georgia's history. And you can see the map on the lower left is showing the storm total. So not just the 24-hour total, but the entire lifespan of the storm was at 27.85 inches in America. So quite a bit. You can see some of these pictures here. I know locally here in Fayette County, that's Starr's Mill there on the right side of the screen. This caused $750 million in damage and resulted in 31 fatalities as a result. It also caused damage to 100 dams and recreational watersheds. It also was considered the costliest tropical cyclone in Georgia until Hurricane Michael in 2018, more recently here. And despite the extensive damage and loss of life caused by this storm, the name Alberto still exists today. It was not retired because it was a tropical storm. Now that has changed. A significant storm like this would have a name retired, but at the time it was not. So tropical storm can come back to haunt us again. If we move to some fall events, we had a quite significant storm resulting from some heavy rainfall in the month of November that caused the failure of Kelly Barnes Dam. There were 39 deaths. It impacted Toccoa Falls College up there, $2.8 million in damage. What was interesting about this is, some of you may know, I see David Griffin was on the call. You may be familiar with the Georgia Safe Dams program. That program really kind of fell out of this. Jimmy Carter was president at the time, and that was soon followed by the National Dam Safety Program. And so we were sort of on the cutting edge there in sort of laying that groundwork. So that was kind of an interesting part of our Georgia history there. And then also in September 2009, this, as I mentioned earlier, this is a career-altering flood event for myself. It changed the trajectory of my career. Just to see the catastrophic damage that was caused. Portions of every interstate in downtown Atlanta was flooded. This was, although we had quite a bit of moisture, this was not a tropical event that caused this. It was just an accumulation of rainfall. It ended up being 21.03 inches of rain that occurred in Douglas County. That was our highest 24-hour total. You can see on the top left there, that's also the portion of the All-American Scream Machine at Six Flags, a wooden roller coaster. Apparently it's fine now. It's been up and running for a while, but there was a catastrophic amount of damage from this one. We did have 10 deaths as a result of this flooding. As Todd mentioned earlier, autos happen to be where most of those fatalities occur. That is the case here as well. 9 of the 10 died in the overnight hours, and 8 of those were in their vehicles. So definitely a hard flood event to kind of work through. I remember here, Todd was here as well. And so we vividly remember that one. Now, if we switch really quickly to winter events, there's 3 that we're going to just touch on briefly. Back in 1919, there was a significant one that the axis of heaviest rainfall really was along the Chattahoochee. And it went all the way down through the middle Chattahoochee and then portions of the Flint. You'll notice on that middle map there at the bottom, those red dots indicate the highest or second highest recorded water levels on the Chattahoochee were set by this event. So there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know. It's like 8 or 9 of those. So quite significant. This was before many of the dam systems were in place. And there's reports of flooding up to about 3 miles away from the main Chattahoochee River channel. Additionally, also along the middle Chattahoochee, we had a heavy rainfall event that occurred in February 1961. You can see on the bottom right sort of a crude image that we colored for you from USGS to show the amount of rainfall. Those pink and purple areas are 16 and 18 inches respectively. So this was really impactful in that it really helped push forward the approval of what became West Point Dam, the approval for it to be constructed. So rather significant for the state. And then finally, more recently, I mentioned Starrs Mill Dam, the picture in 1994. Similar flooding occurred in 2015. And you'll notice in that picture, sort of near the middle, is an actual USGS river gauge house that was providing some real-time reports for us. It's no longer there, unfortunately, not because of this flooding, but due to a lack of funding. But you can see during the December 2015 event, the map on the lower right is showing anywhere between 10 and about 13 inches in the South Metro area and then portions of West Central Georgia. We had widespread minor to moderate flood damage that impacted 108 of our river gauge locations. This was a really substantial event for us. And some of that has to do with the fact that the majority of the flooding occurred on either Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. So it was a precarious time for local officials to be out trying to offer some assistance during a holiday period. Okay, so moving on to sort of, well, this is what's happened in the past. What do we have in store for the future? And so we can't move forward without talking about the hurricane season. It's been rather active, especially over this last week. We just have another named storm within the last 24 hours or so. And so it has definitely been a busy season. On this image here, you can see this is Hurricane Idalia. Right over the state of Georgia, and then Franklin off over the Atlantic that we could see at the same time on the satellite picture. Sometimes that's common during the peak of hurricane season, that late August, September timeframe, where you can get really nice pictures of multiple storms out churning. Now, because we have a new named storm, Lee, this slide is actually a bit out of date. So you can see the hurricane season names there on the left. All of the ones with the cross through them they're ones that we've already hopefully said goodbye to. It appears, I think it's Katia, Jose, and Lee that are out there now.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
So we're halfway through our name list. We have 21 names that make up a typical hurricane season. They omit some of those harder alphabetical names And so we don't have like X and Y and Z, for example. But so if we overflow this list like we did in some more recent years, like in 2005, we start going into an alternate list, and hopefully it will not come to that. Now, we've been really fortunate that most of these storms have stayed out to sea. The image here is a couple days old, so it only goes through about half of Idalia's track there. And so hopefully we won't get any more, but like Todd says, it only takes one. Now, this is the latest mid-season update from the Hurricane Center. The projection is still to have 14 to 21 named storms. I think we're somewhere around 11, with 6 to 11 of those being hurricanes and 2 to 5 of those being major hurricanes, of which Idalia was a major hurricane. And moving forward, you know, outside of the tropics, this is really what we're continuing to look for the fall season. So this is September, October, November projection from the Climate Prediction Center. So the one on the left is showing your temperatures. So for the state of Georgia and for a majority of the Southeast, we are expecting above normal temperatures. And in contrast, we're looking for above normal rainfall. So sometimes when we get those above normal temperatures, it's looking a little dry around here, but for us, it's looking warm and wet, particularly over the eastern portion of the state. Now, as we move into winter, we have transitioned away from La Nina, which has been in place for the last few years, and we're moving into an El Nino. This is an observation or a way of classifying the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which kind of a brief overview, if you're looking at the map on the left, El Nino is a warming of the waters in the Pacific off the coast of South America. And a La Nina, in contrast, is a cooling of those waters off South America. And so because of the influence the ocean has on our atmospheric circulations, we actually can kind of get a better idea of what the season outlook is going to be moving forward.
Laura, Todd, I believe y'all are on mute.
Okay. How much did you hear?
I think it was right as you were switching over to the other slide.
Okay.
So if we can go back one and pick up from there, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yes, sorry about that. Okay, so if we look at the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is sort of a coupling of our ocean condition or ocean circulations and our atmospheric circulations, we can get an idea of what weather conditions are going to be like from a seasonal perspective. So we are expected to move into El Nino, or we are in El Nino, and that will continue into the winter months. Just as a reminder, El Nino is a warming of the Pacific waters off the South American coast. And in contrast, La Nina is a cooling of those same waters off South America. And again, we are expecting this to continue through the winter months. Fortunately for us, that's when we have the highest correlation as far as the predictability of an El Nino on our temperatures and our rainfall. So if we were to look and see how this rainfall, or excuse me, how this El Nino really projects on the Southeast United States, we can go back and look and see the more recent El Nino seasons. So they're listed there on those maps on the right, several years. And so you can see that it typically means that we have cooler temperatures, which are shown on the lower right, and then wetter conditions, which are shown on the top right. And so a nice little summary here on the left is wet and cool conditions. And a lot of that has to do with how we have a splitting of the jet as it carries systems into our area. It's really positioned well over us. So what does this mean for us moving forward? Well, the Climate Prediction Center is forecasting for the December, January, February timeframe sort of an equal chance of below or above average temperatures. So we'll see where this lands, especially as we get closer to this time frame. But we are predicting above normal rainfall. So we're using this time to tell our users and our partners, be flood ready, be flood aware. For those who are living in floodplains, now would be a good time to get flood insurance. Make sure it's in place ahead of a potentially very wet season for us.
So I'll go ahead and I'll continue on with our hydro winter outlook. I'm going to go back to that. As she mentioned, it's usually cooler and wetter. But in the last few years, it's been rare that they show cooler than normal temperatures. Each year, it seems like we're either normal or above normal in many of these seasonal outlooks. So it is really rare to see that. So actually seeing equal chances during this time really does kind of equate now to below normal. So the cool and wet is really what we're expecting. And so what does that mean? So this is, if you look at this is a pie chart showing during an El Nino winter, what kind of flows in the rivers do we get? And it's a pie chart. And so you'll see the larger green in a lot of the southeast, that shows above normal stream flows in those areas. The yellow indicates a normal stream flow, and the red indicates below normal stream flow. So one of the things December through February, as you take a peek through this, is you'll see that you see a lot of green and very little red. So we're either near normal or above normal with our stream flows in each of these months during an El Nino. So that's the concern. As Laura mentioned before, that's why we want people to be prepared. That doesn't mean that it's definitely going to happen, because we've seen years where it has been below normal. It doesn't, it's not a hard and fast rule. However, we tend to lean towards that. And so we want people to be prepared as we go into that. So based on so here is your next question that you need to answer. Question 2 is, based on the seasonal outlook, what kind of weather should we expect this winter?
So again, if you're hoping to get the continuing education credit, please respond to the poll or respond with your answer in the chat. Okay, looks like responses are slowing down. And 88% of people have responded with cooler and wetter conditions. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now.
And that is correct. It does look like cooler and wetter. Like I said, in some cases, they show an average in there that maybe we'll near normal, or they don't have anything to indicate that, but it does look wetter, especially during that time, and it's oftentimes cooler. So with that, I'll continue on, and we'll go kind of to an Italia review. And so we'll look and see what happened. So this is kind of a reflection of what happened last week, and we'll have a little lesson here too. Like I said, we usually give a longer explanation of some of the things that we look at when a storm is moving towards the southeast. But we'll focus on one today. But one of the things that happened, so we saw that the storm had developed near Cuba, and by the time it was getting to the coast, we could see that it was headed into Florida, would affect Georgia, South Carolina, parts of North Carolina, and so we watched that very closely. So why do hurricanes and tropical systems produce so much rain? So for the most part, they develop over the ocean because conditions warrant that. So we get easterlies or westerlies, easterlies that move into the area, a wave or so forth, and it develops in these warm, moist climates. And it's that warm Caribbean and Gulf moisture that helps fuel these storms and creates these large storms. And they eventually will move inland. And when they do, they start to lose their strength, but they also bring a great deal of moisture and a great deal of rain to the area. So tropical systems tend to be very efficient and drop a lot of rainfall as they move through. So is strength an important indicator of whether we're going to get rainfall? Well, you know what? A strong storm, we've had Michael that came in, and while it was a strong storm, did a great deal of damage in the southeast. It didn't produce a ton of rainfall. So that wasn't the issue. Is the size? Well, the size might have a little bit, but not necessarily, because you can have a big storm, but if it's moving very quickly, you might not end up getting a lot of rain. And so they're not reliable indicators. It does give you a little hint, maybe as you're going forward, but it's not reliable. So cyclones are typically steered by winds in large-scale weather systems. So back in 2005, when Katrina came through, we had high pressure sitting on the East Coast and low pressure sitting in the upper Midwest or kind of near the mountains there. And so it created like a funnel. And what it did was we could predict it really well, and it moved really quickly through the Southeast because it was being pushed through very quickly. So it was a quick moving storm, even though it was a very strong storm and very dangerous, but it didn't produce quite as much rainfall. So it moved much faster. And then you have weak conditions in the upper atmosphere where it can't steer it. It doesn't move a whole lot. So you have Tropical Storm Allison that, because there weren't a whole lot of upper level winds to move stuff around, it just sits and it rains. So a very slow moving system that sat over Houston and produced some significant flooding. So what is the relationship between the two? Well, you're slower your storm speed, the more likely you are to have extreme heavy rainfall. The faster you go, the less likely you are to have extreme rainfall. And so that's a lot of times what we're looking at when we're doing that. Now, we usually go into all four of these as we talk about the different things that you can get, but I'm going to focus on one non-cyclone feature, and we're going to give an example, and then we're going to show the storm. So one of the non-cyclone features, this was the track of another Alberto back in 2006. We had Tropical Storm Alberto that moved across the southeast, and as it did, there happened to be a front, a stationary front that was sitting across the Carolinas. And as the storm, we had cool, efficient, stable, and less efficient on one side. And then on the other side of the front, we had warm, unstable tropical air mass. And as it moved up that, the air rose over the front, and it rose rapidly. And so it was a focus of the heavy rainfall. And you can see along that front, we had heavy rainfall all through that area in North Carolina. So let's jump forward in time. And you can see that this was our weather maps for last week. And as the storm was moving in, you can see these were the forecasts. And you can see one of the things that we were looking at and concerned about was that we had a frontal system that was sitting here in the southeast, and that a storm was moving through. So we were very concerned about the rainfall associated with both the storm and that front. These were the forecasts as it was moving on shore. This was in the 1 to 2 day as it was getting ready to move on shore. And this was for the whole week. So you can see that the forecasters who were making these predictions and the models were looking and seeing that this could be where we could see the heaviest rainfall. And sure enough, this was out of our briefing that we put out during the storm to talk about it and talk about the flooding that went along with it. You can see a very sharp, this was the actual estimated rainfall from our radars. And again, very close to where that front was and very isolated in those areas. So that was while the storm was moving through and the issues that we had when it was going through. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Laura because she's got a couple other little tidbits to throw in here, especially about the winds and some of the rain that happened before.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier in the Georgia history section about Hurricane Michael, and that was a really significant wind producer across the South Georgia area back in 2018. We didn't quite see that with Idalia, but we did see some rather significant wind events or wind observations in the southern portion of the state. Anything that's in the kind of brighter orange color down near Valdosta and into South Florida, that's above 60-mile-per-hour wind speeds. So there was quite a bit of damage down in that area, and then extended even far into what we would consider our forecast area, closer to the Cordele, Vidalia areas, and that's the portion of the National Weather Service Peachtree City office area of responsibility. So this tends to be a very common question post-event, what the wind speeds were. So I did want to throw this in here. But then I also wanted to kind of touch really quickly on Todd's note about the rainfall. So here's just another way to show what he has already shown. So that 6 to 8 inch rainfall totals there in Southeast Georgia, 2 to 3 inches closer to the Dublin area, and then 4 to 6 down near Valdosta. So there's a nice little axis there. Now, what's interesting is if you go back and look at the 3-day total of rainfall, it was a very wet period ahead of Idalia's landfall. And what's interesting is there was almost as much rain up across portions of North Georgia, a little more isolated in nature, but this is where you're seeing the combination of what Todd spoke about earlier with the tropical scale flooding versus a smaller scale flooding. All those values that you're seeing up over far North Georgia and the metro area along I-20, that would fall into more of that small scale type flooding event, and was rather significant in some of these areas where we saw some quite a few flooding event reports in those, and the rainfall amounts that were observed in those areas were upwards of 8 inches for a 24-hour period, which was quite remarkable.
And the one other concern we had was we had all this rain in the days leading up to the storm. We were concerned if that front didn't dip down enough, that if this storm went a little further north and went over North Georgia after just getting these rainfalls, that we can see some real significant river flooding, even more significant than we did see in that part of the state. So, I mean, those are the kinds of things that we're monitoring and looking at, so that when a storm's coming in, we're evaluating and see where we may have big issues, so we can warn and we can give people a heads up.
And with that, that's the end of our slides, and we can turn it back over to Emily.
Yes, in case there are any questions and anybody wants to ask anything.
Okay. Well, while we give everybody a minute to type something into the chat real quick, I did have a question. You mentioned Tropical Storm Lee has formed, and it's expected to become a major hurricane by the weekend, but it's a little early to figure out, is it going to impact Georgia at this point? So is there somewhere where we can go and kind of monitor the storm's progress, or any of the activities that y'all have?
I'm going to sneak a slide in here, and then we'll come back to the slideshow here in a moment. But the National Hurricane Center puts out can you see this okay?
Yes.
Okay. The National Hurricane Center does put out this every day, and they update it regularly. And this is where you can go to see what they're expecting of the storms. Right now, like I said, I think we only have one storm out there now. We ended up, I guess the Katia ended up falling apart. But then you can look and see what their predictions are and where it's supposed to go. And so a lot of times we're using this a lot. We're paying attention so that we're prepared in case we do get a storm. And you can see the hurricane is expected to form, and by 8 a.m. on Friday, it's supposed to be a major hurricane. And it is still a concern for us because we support Puerto Rico in their flood operations. And fortunately, right now, it looks like it's headed north of Puerto Rico. We still could have some issues with bands and it getting close to Puerto Rico. And so we'll still have to deal with some of that. But right now, looking at the models, it looks like it's going to turn north and stay away from the southeast U.S. So we're crossing our fingers and hoping that that's the case. So, but that's where you can go. And You know, if you just Google NHC, the National Hurricane Center, you can get to this site, and it's a great site to look at. It has tons and tons of information, so hopefully that's something that you can go take a look at if you need to.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Uh, do they also keep a lot of the archives or historical records that, you know, if I wanted to go back and look at, say, the storms that occurred last year and what happened, they have that kind of thing there as well?
Yes, they do. And I think that was
Okay.
one of the slides that Laura may have had about the current season so far. But yes, they have the past years. You can go find out information about each of those different storms. So yes, and they have a plethora of climatology, of past storms, and of different, and analyzing all that information. So yeah, that site is a treasure trove of information if you're interested.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So with that, give you one more minute. Okay. I found this absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much, Laura and Todd, for everything you presented to us, because it just kind of brings all that wonderful information that we use every day together. And I hope everyone else enjoyed this presentation as well. We're going to keep the chat open for just a few more seconds. So if you have a question, please be sure to put it in there along with your email address so we can follow up with you. Mark November 1st on your calendar for our next Lunch and Learn webinar. And we will be putting a survey link in the chat as well. And I appreciate everybody completing that chat so we can we can get a good idea and of what's going on and what we can do to improve these webinars. We are offering one continuing education credit for today's session, available to certified floodplain managers that completed the poll questions and provide their name and email address in the chat now. A copy of the presentation will be emailed to all attendees. If you're requesting continuing education credits, those certificates will be emailed separately. Once more, our next Lunch and Learn is scheduled for November 1st. So be on the lookout for that invitation. And with that, thank you again for attending today's event. And if you don't have any other questions, this will end our Lunch and Learn webinar. Thank you so much again. Have a great day. Oh, wait a minute. We do have somebody.
Yeah, Emily, I think we have somebody with their hand raised. I don't know.
Yes.
John
John.
Hudgens. I don't know if that's an accident. So we can see if we can.
Yeah, I think he put his hand down.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think he was raising his hand to indicate he had an answer.
Okay. All right.